One of our top stories, the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority has recommended lifting the pause on the Sisonke study, provided certain conditions are met. This follows SAHPRA's engagements with the Sisonke Phase 3B implementation study team and the Janssen Pharmaceutica. The focus of the engagement was on the safety data reported from the Sisonke study following administration of the COVID-19 vaccine Janssen, as well as the adverse events reported in the United States of America. I spoke to SAHPRA board chairperson, Professor Helen Rees, about this significant development a short while ago. Take a look.
I think to understand the conditions, we'd have to understand why the pause was put on in the first place. And it was a pause that was initiated by ethics committees as well as the regulatory authority. What happened was that as they rolled out the J&J vaccine in the United States, where they've immunized nearly 7 million people, they identified 6 cases of a very rare condition called CVST. And what it is the formation of a clot in one of the major vessels in the brain, but accompanied by what are called low platelets. And platelets are an essential part of the blood clotting mechanism. So this is a very rare condition. And so the FDA last week said, well, we want to investigate this a little bit further to see whether we think this is actually associated with the J&J vaccine or not. The condition's also been seen with the AstraZeneca vaccine, and the same sort of inquiry has gone on there to say, is it associated with the vaccine? Is it just chance because so many million people are being vaccinated? And if it is associated, what is the risk of getting that versus the risk of getting thrombosis because of COVID, which also carries a high risk of causing clots? So all of that is the backdrop to this. And so a temporary pause was put onto the study while we tried to learn more from the Food and Drug Administration in the United States about whether they thought there was an association or not, and who were these people who got the clot. Did they have pre-existing diseases that might make them more likely to have clots, yes or no? So as I say, to understand the pause and why we started again, we must first understand that. So what's happened now is that the Food and Drug Administration are continuing to look, but they've also started to make statements from the US. But we've had the country's experts really looking at the reports that we've seen, and we've been talking to the World Health Organization. And the feeling is across all the expertise that we have is that the risk, we haven't seen any cases in South Africa, but the risk in the United States is extremely small when you compare it to the risk of clots that can happen with COVID infection, which is really very, very significant. So that's why we're saying, even if there is a risk, even if the vaccine might be precipitating the risk of this very rare condition, that risk is a very, very tiny risk when compared to the risk of clots from COVID. And that's why we think it's very important that we resume vaccinating.
Right. So
I'll pause, but you want to know that want to know the conditions.
Yes.
I'll pause there because I've spoken for a long time.
Go on. So with regards to these conditions, yeah.
Yeah. So the conditions are, so we, as I said, we've spoken to some of our countries and international experts, on clotting and thromboses and these rare blood conditions. And so what we're going to be doing is asking if anybody has a genetic condition that predisposes them to clots or has a past history of having had clots of any sort. And then they're going to have specialist counseling. They're not going to be refused the vaccine, but what they will be explained is that there might or might not be an increased risk of this very rare sort of clot. We wouldn't know, we don't know at the moment whether these familial conditions or a past history is going to increase the risk of this with the vaccine. But we also know that the risk from COVID of causing clots is very, very high. So we'll be counseling people so that they can take a decision. Right. But the feeling is that we're not stopping people having it, but we are going to say, we've noted this, here's the risk, here's the benefit, and we're going to try and counsel people to make their own choice.
Without a screen or test, how would one know if they are at high risk of a blood clotting disorder? Are there any signs or symptoms that one needs to look out for?
Well, I think for the there are genetic conditions that increase your risk. And there, very often people will either have had a clot in the past themselves, or they will know from their family history that this is something that is carried in their family's genes. So those kinds of very, very rare genetic conditions that run in families are often known in the family because of past histories of clots from relatives or from yourself. That would be the first thing. The second thing is that many people who've had clots will pretty certainly know about it. Very often, the common one that people will probably be familiar with are clots in the lower part of the leg. Now, these kinds of clots often happen when you're immobile, after you've had an operation, after you've had an accident and you've had to be lying still. These kinds of clots happen in the leg, and you get pain in the lower part of the leg and swelling. The worry about these clots is that little pieces can break off, and they can particularly go to the lungs, and there people will present with shortness of breath, chest pain, and that can be a life-threatening condition. So those are the sort of common kinds of clots that people have. But you can get clots anywhere in the body. You can get them in your eyes. You can get them in as I say, in legs. You can really get them in many parts of the body. And if people have had them, they will pretty certainly know about it and will be able to say, yes, I've had a past history of a clot.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Prof. COVID itself causes clots in the lungs, legs, brain, etc., correct?
That's the issue here, is that, you know, of course, we're going to be very careful with all the vaccines if we see any sort of safety signal, and we're going to understand it. But when you see a safety signal that's extremely rare coming from the United States, less than 1 in a million, and you know that with 1 million cases of COVID, that those people who get severe disease, that 20% end of people who get severe disease, including those who end up in hospital, one of the major reasons for that severe disease is clotting. And these clots can be either big clots, but very often they're very small clots, and in particular affect the lungs, but they can really affect any of the organs of the body. Clotting is one of the main reasons that people get organ failure, get organs affected, get kidney affected, the heart, the lungs, even the brain. That is one of the main reasons why COVID is such a deadly disease at that end of the severe end of the spectrum. So that's why we're saying the risk from clots with COVID is so great. The risk that we're seeing, if it is associated with this vaccine, is very, very small. And so the importance of protecting yourself from COVID is just probably the dominant thing that we need to think about.
Maybe to put it another way, I was just listening to a doctor the other day saying it's much safer to get the vaccine and not get COVID than get the vaccine and get clots, correct? You would agree with that?
I think just about I haven't heard any clinician or scientist that says don't get the vaccine because of the fear of clots. I think everyone is saying the risk of COVID is so great, and clotting with COVID isn't a real issue. Nobody wants to get COVID, and we don't yet know whether we're going to have this third wave and when it's coming. So the sooner we can vaccinate people, the better.
Right. Is it true, Professor, that blood clotting is more common in women than men because women have a higher risk for thrombosis?
Well, I think there's two things. One is in the United States, and with the AstraZeneca vaccine, they have seen a predominance of women. And that's why you need to understand this. Was there any other risk factor that woman might have had? For example, being on the combined oral contraceptive pill, being postpartum, having had a baby recently. So they have seen a predominance of women in this case. But generally speaking, you know, women do have more risk factors, often because of the things that happen to women in life. Pregnancy is a risk factor. After pregnancy, the postpartum period is a risk factor. Taking, as I say, the pill is a risk factor. So quite often women have these other things happening in their lives or in their bodies that can also predispose them to clots.
Right. So let's go back to this study. If a participant in the Sisonke study develops a blood clotting disorder after vaccination, what is the process that follows immediately?
Yes, and that's the other part of what's being put in place. So people are being advised that if you do get any symptoms that could be suggestive of a clot, that you go straight away and you present yourself for treatment, because early treatment with thrombosis is highly effective. And the kinds of things that we're saying are, as we said, swelling in the lower part of the legs, shortness of breath, pains in the abdomen, a severe headache in this case. So anyone who's getting a severe headache or blurring of vision. So everyone's going to have that explained to them. If you get any of those symptoms, we're saying go straight away and present yourself and let people know that you've had the vaccine, because in the event, the rare event that this is a clot, then early treatment can be very effective, and that's what we're encouraging people to do.
So I guess the big question that many will ask now, since SAHPRA has come out and said that they recommend lifting the pause, is when will the Sisonke Phase 3B implementation study resume? What's the process now that follows?
So the research team are putting together, they're changing what we call the informed consent. That's the consent sheet that people sign, and it has a lot of information, including giving people guidance of these suggestive symptoms. But in addition to SAHPRA saying that this is okay, the ethics committees that also approve these different sites around the country also have to say, yes, it's fine to get going. But I think everybody, collectively, everyone recognizes that it's very, very urgent that we get going, not only because we want to protect healthcare workers as quickly as possible, but we also want to get public confidence. We want to make sure that we don't do anything unnecessary that shakes public confidence.
So how long do you think that will take in terms of getting the ethics committee's approval?
I think we're all hoping that we'll start again next week.
Okay, all right, as soon as next week. Look, Prof, good data from trials is one thing, but as you release these vaccines to the larger population, help our viewers understand, and I think it will talk to giving the public confidence if they understand the process. Help us understand if it's normal practice to keep on reviewing this data as often as it's being done now.
It is, and particularly when you roll out new vaccines, any new vaccine under any circumstances into the population. Because although you've got a lot of safety data in the case of the COVID vaccines on tens of thousands of people per vaccine, when you roll it out to millions of people, you might well identify really rare conditions that might or might not be associated with the vaccine. So we need to be able to reassure people that we're going to look not only for the common things like the sore arm, feeling a bit muscle achy and chills. We are looking for those, but we're really looking for sort of rare things that wouldn't necessarily have been picked up in any clinical trials. So I think that's actually very reassuring. And the fact that this has happened around these vaccines shows that we've been very successful at picking up really, really rare events. But then we have to say, is it likely that that rare event was just chance because you've now got large swathes of population immunized? Or is there a biological reason with the vaccine why we think that that vaccine might have something to do with that extremely rare event? And that's called causality. And so we're doing this all the time. And this is something we do for all vaccines, all new vaccines, when we roll them out, so that we make sure that they are safe and we can give proper guidance.
Clarity. All right, that was Professor Helen Rees, SAHPRA board chair, there explaining their decision in terms of recommending the lifting of the pause of the Sisonke study. We'll have much more in the next hour.